For many years, the European Cultural Foundation asked about this other Europe, another Europe, but from a specific perspective that I think comes to light in the book. It was about an expanded Europe, a Europe that wouldn't be made up of exclusively of the European Union, or countries that traditionally would be considered part of the European space, but another Europe, as you understand it, was a far broader concept that also included neighboring countries, fringes, and this other Europe also included Ukraine, Turkey, the Balkans in their entirety. And I'd like to ask two questions about this other Europe. First of all, now, when in many of the neighboring countries we're witnessing striking events, the war in Ukraine, the tendencies that are becoming apparent in Turkey, for instance, politically, how is this vision of another expanded Europe that you were working on? How does this vision relate to what we have now? And isn't it a great challenge to think in terms of another Europe being in the center of Europe today, when we're dealing with, as Catherine Watson mentioned at the opening, when we're dealing with disintegration and eccentric tendencies within Europe? Let me just recall that the day after tomorrow, we'll see the French national elections and see how the Front National fares. We have Brexit, but we also have these eccentric tendencies within our region, including Poland. These tendencies. So the question, does the center of Europe need another Europe? And if so, what kind of Europe?
Thank you, Igor. I maybe should start to explain that this concept of another Europe and the publication you referred to is not only a theoretical concept. It was predominantly conceived as a documentation of more than 15 years of very practical work and exploration of concepts in praxis. The European Cultural Foundation has been, since the late 90s, been very active in collaborating, strengthening, and working with cultural initiatives outside the European Union. Two of them you saw already earlier on the panel today. So another Europe is not a theoretical concept. It includes a chapter which refer and relate to theoretical concepts that we derived from practice. But our practical work with cultural initiatives in the European Union neighborhood countries comes from a very deeply ingrained understanding and recognition and belief of the European Cultural Foundation that Europe, of course, does not stop at the borders of the European Union. And culture does not stop at borders anyway. And our whole work in the past decades was always based on the strong belief that we need to invest in transnational cultural collaboration in order to derive new ideas for how societies could develop locally through cultural initiatives, how we can develop new political concept based on that. And that goes, I think, back all the way to our founder, Denis de Rougemont, who was one of the very first federalists and who had the idea of Europe as a federation, not so much of countries, of states, in that sense of classic diplomacy, but in the sense of federation of ideas, of people, of different cultural ideas and cultural expressions. And in that logic, we have in our grant making developed more and more contacts by the end of the 90s with initiatives like Eminas in ex-Yugoslavia. And from there, a whole set of programs for strengthening small initiatives, small organizational structures, positioning them in a policy dialogue locally has emerged. And that was our idea of another Europe outside the European Union borders. But just for the record, back then, that was already long before even Poland and Hungary and the Central and Eastern European countries joined the European Union. So even that was still outside the neighborhood back then when we started. So over the years, we have developed different programs for the neighboring countries in the east, for Turkey, for the Arab countries along the Mediterranean shore, and have developed many contacts with partners and colleagues there, with the idea that, yes, Europe doesn't stop at the borders, and also, of course, our solidarity, our pan-European idea of transnational solidarity, of course, automatically has to include these initiatives who, of course, 15, 20 years ago, like maybe now again, are operating in very challenging and transformational situations. Nowadays, our largest program that brings together cultural initiatives inside the European Union and outside the European Union is a program called Tandem, which allows cultural initiatives outside the European and inside the European Union to engage with each other on a really truly equal footing. You spend 2 weeks as a cultural operator in your partner organization's office. Your partner has an opportunity to spend 2 weeks at your office, and you get an opportunity to realize a small-scale project together. And yes, returning to your question, and I don't have an answer. Of course, this sort of work, which was only 6 years ago when Tandem was launched, pretty straightforward. The next step of closer cultural relations with cultural initiatives outside the European Union. Of course, this is tremendously challenged now. In Ukraine, in Turkey, in the Arab world. I cannot answer your question of like what would be the next step now. I can only tell you that we discuss a lot about, in general, in Tandem is a program that is supposed to relate an ever-growing number of tandems or initiatives in a sort of network of solidarity, in a network, or if I can call it what Manuel Castells wrote a book called Networks of Outreach and Hope. Maybe for Tandem we could say we're trying to establish networks of outreach and hope and solidarity. And of course, solidarity is at the moment, when you think about cultural initiatives in civil society in Turkey and in Ukraine, something these initiatives need a lot. And so it's not only a civil society program, just to give you not the wrong impression. We also have like public museums, so everybody is actually in Tandem, which also makes it an interesting system of establishing new contacts and cross-fertilizing new ideas with other sectors. We have journalists, we have people who come more from the social innovation, social enterprise field. So this is going on at the moment. We hear from our participants at the moment in Tandem Turkey that we are some sort of like their only remaining window to Europe, especially as we have a lot of initiatives in our Tandem programs that work very far in Eastern Anatolia, in Southeast Anatolia, and very turbulent cities and rural areas. We have in Ukraine very small-scale initiatives that had to leave Donbass and now are operating along the borderline. So this is what we can. It's a matter of like providing them with a sort of resilience. But I cannot claim that we have an answer of how this would evolve yet. The only thing I feel very strongly about is that it's time when this transnational solidarity and going beyond European Union borders, as we always have been doing, is ever more important, and also I have to admit, ever more challenging, and also for the European partners to inside the European to collaborate with these organizations, also Polish organizations working in Ukraine, for example, or Belarus or Russia also. But for the moment, providing this supportive network and solidarity pan-European network is something we can do with this program. Now, to your second question, do we need that inside Europe as well? I can again only answer that with learning we made based on our experiences with this tandem collaboration program, but also with many of the other programs the European Cultural Foundation does. We launched 2 years ago a very specific tandem transnational collaboration program edition for facilitating transnational collaboration between initiatives only inside the European Union, with a specific topic focusing on new, not only cultural ideas, but ideas coming out of communities in the field of social innovation. So in this field we have, for example, tandem collaborations between a journalist network in Greece and a journalist network in Germany. And there, the very explicit idea was, yes, that we wanted to break through this north-south divide which exists inside the European, this east-west, east learns from west, south learns from north. And we heard already this morning, and some contributions already were made this morning in terms of how completely new initiatives and ways of working have emerged in the south of Europe and east of Europe. And this is exactly what we try to facilitate with this Tandem Europe Social Innovation edition. And this is a practical answer for the moment. Our analytical work based on our practice continues, but from a conceptual point of view, I think these are also times where we all need to take a moment to kind of like pause also and reflect what's really going on and what could be next practical steps, programs, new programs maybe, to develop.
Thank you very much for this. Philipp has distinctively said that this is a moment of reflection and this is a moment of redefinition of what one does in culture as opposed to in society, and where the interlinkages between the cultural and the societal is. So I would like to ask Katherine about this. The European Cultural Foundation has been known for this self-reflective and strategic perspective, and amongst the categories and social practices and institutional practices that the European Cultural Foundation has worked with over the past several years include the common good, the interlinkages between culture and communities, and now the next big thing is solidarity. And Philipp has mentioned that already as well. So let me ask Karin first. Katherine, sorry. First, how come you have decided that within your organization, the solidarity was the hot topic, was the thing to focus on right now? And do you have any ideas how you can go about raising the level of solidarity between individuals in society and at the European, pan-European level?
Thank you, Igor. It's really a happy opening for you to talk about reflection, and I think I would add to that responsiveness, because one of the responsibilities that we feel is also to make those changes, to interrogate ourselves and make those changes to best be able to work together with civil society, bringing the resources that we might have and thinking them differently, not being stuck in previous paradigms or older ways, previous ways of working. So, and we do try to do that. Not always having the answer, as Philipp has said, but at least trying to break out and step in new directions. The crises that we are being faced globally, are the intersecting and incredibly entangled crises. So if you look at economic, political, and democratic, and social, cultural crises, you can't see them, I don't believe, in a sequential manner that one necessarily followed the other, nor could you even unpick and say where it started. And the other side of that is then by solving one, you can't then move on to solve the other because of this entanglement. The result of this entanglement, I believe, and the inability to be able to address the challenges particularly and solve them has resulted, but also been exacerbated by an increasing fragmentation and increasing disintegration of any social solidarity that we had. And this is not necessarily to say that we've moved from a moment where we were in complete solidarity on everything to a moment where we're not. We still were in development, I believe, and are in development, but the disintegration has been palpable. And we see that in the fragmentation that has built into ever more specific islands that build higher walls and throw bigger rocks over at the other islands. So this marginalization, exclusion, alienation, and inequality is on the rise, and empathy, compassion, certainly on the downfall. Not, of course, 100%, because that's what gives us the sense of we need to be responsive, because there are ways. There is, as Philipp has said, if we talk about networks of hope, or we talk about the grassroots initiatives that are happening, the citizen-led movements that are making change, that is where we need to look and say, how can we, all of us, work together to support and enable more of those kind of actions to happen. So in the dual challenge of the fragments becoming more individualized, so not even just two fragments, you get more and more and more and more, and people and institutions more being in a very isolated bubble. At the same time, we have these initiatives that are trying to change that and recognizing that's one of the things that needs to be addressed, and that's where we'd like to be able to come in the ecosystem and believe we're part of it as well. I think we believe there's ingredients that need to be in place to help redress this. And a lot of those ingredients have been mentioned in the previous panels and by the audience. One, this move away from the fragmentation, the bubbles, into more inclusive spaces, in more inclusive societies. And that poses an incredible challenge for all of us, because it means we have to even step further out of the comfort zone of who we see and what we see in that inclusivity into trying to work together, bring together, speak together, and listen to those who we may not have agreed with. And it may be difficult to say, well, you go completely in an extreme and you find yourself talking to someone totally radical, or an organization that has beliefs and ideology that are completely counter to what you believe in. So I'm not saying that you or that might be productive, because that's a difficult, not only difficult, almost impossible conversation to have. But there are a great group of people who have felt left behind and marginalized that are somehow drawn. And those are it's how do you arrest and stop a shift moving by being more inclusive, to listen to what the concerns are, recognize fears if they are there, and try and work together to ensure that you, instead of making the rift bigger, that you bring it a little bit closer together. I think that requires safe spaces for conversations to happen, and in cultural organizations and organizations that may not define themselves as cultural organizations, in many places are those safe spaces. In places of extreme conflict, they are those safe spaces, and in places that may not be in conflict but are in moments of change and upheaval are also those safe spaces, and that needs to be fostered and enabled. I mean, I think of the hubs that we work with, like Subtopia, who you'll hear from, political critique as well, in Chisinau, all have a desire to provide spaces where people can come together, and knowing that it will take time. Amina mentioned this morning, she said, participation is nothing without consequences. So we all talk about participation. We talk about it as well, involvement, engagement, inclusivity. But I think if we're not looking at trying to support meaningful participation that has outcomes and a shared interest in the outcomes. So the participation will often start by a seed on whether it's civil society organization saying, you know, we have an idea that you take to policymakers. It needs a receptive ear on the other side. And sometimes a very progressive policymaking will say, we would want to fully institute more citizen participation. So wherever it comes from, it needs to be comfortably sit with both sides and be supported. And the last ingredient, I think, to this is being able to amplify other narratives, to be able to take these experiences, exactly what we're talking about, into policymaking arenas in order to enable more of it to happen or more sustainably happen, be embedded, and also take narratives into mainstream media and conversation and communication. So that for me is the other ingredient as well, because then you can help also break into those bubbles that are more isolated, have chosen to listen only to those whose message is confirming what they believe in, and in fact recreating that same thing. So I think all of it, what we're facing now, or what is an opportunity, there has been, I think, a crisis of confidence in civil society in the face of the solidarity that people might have felt was there, and all of a sudden, it's not all of a sudden, but right now it's not, and you're looking over your shoulder and wondering where threats are coming from and where the next schism will appear. And that crisis of confidence has also meant that there's a crisis of leadership, because I think our leaders do also need to grow out of that. They aren't molded somewhere off on a cloud. They do come out and must come out of civil society in order to avoid what is happening now, where the voids are filled by things and people and ideologies that will further increase the fragmentation, and will ultimately, there will be no solidarity left.
Bardzo dziękuję za...
Thank you, Katherine, for this intervention. That's a great point of departure for further discussion, and this is a very good ground for me to ask the question. Subtopia is a safe place to create cultural dialogue. And this is exactly what I would like to ask Karin about, the practical aspects of cultural dialogue, to emphasize Subtopia's specialty in operating in a multicultural environment. But before I do ask the question, I would like to ask an earlier question, if you like. Have you noticed any change in approach in your community? Have you seen a change in attitudes towards refugees or refugee communities that live in and around you? Have you seen any change in the attitudes of Swedish citizens? And have you seen any change in attitudes in the migrant communities or refugee communities towards the Swedish society in the context of growing xenophobia? So have you seen any trend, any tendency in the relationship between the Swedish and the migrant population? And two, how should this cultural dialogue be led and managed in a practical sense now and in the future?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's been a change, and I've been working with this for 18 years. That's a really long time, because when you work with this, you have to give it time, because there is no quick fix. And I want to give you the context, because the municipality where Subtopia is located is the most diverse municipality in not only in Sweden, but in the Nordic countries. It's about 172 nationalities. There are 192 states in the world. And there is over 100 spoken languages. And so that's the picture. And when we started to work 18 years ago, the image, the self-image among the inhabitants were only based upon problems. I'm a problem. Because almost 60% of the inhabitants in the whole municipality do have another mother tongue than Swedish. So the self-image and the surrounding world's image was based upon problems. And when you have these kind of problems, it's almost impossible. You don't have any tricks or clever methods to solve them. So you have to kind of turn things upside down and start to work with the possibilities, even if they are really, really small. So we decided in the municipality, and I'm not talking about only Subtopia, the whole political system, the whole community decided to change the way to work. And that was a really, really painful step. Not so much for the politicians, surprisingly, but for the officials working in the municipality, the experts, because what was decided, the first thing we decided to do was to move officials away from the big city hall to start to work out in the neighborhoods. And we also invited people living in the municipality to sit around the table to start a discussion, not about, but with people. And that was quite threatening to the officials and some other people to do that. And we also involved different NGOs, associations, and we actually literally gave them the key, the power to influence, the access and economy to do things. So the best thing when we started this discussion, the possibilities that we found was about culture and how to work with culture in a broad perspective as for social development, not only the culture artistic expression, also that of course, but as a social vehicle or for development. We also decided to work with 6 different goals together with the inhabitants to increase democracy and influence. That was the most important thing, to include people. And to increase education among the inhabitants, because a lot of the people that are inhabitants, they come from different parts of the world without any education. So that is important. Creating jobs for them. Also changing the image of Botkyrka, of course. And when we had formulated these 6 goals, we decided to work, as I said, with culture as a tool or a vehicle to reach these goals. And now I'm coming to your question. 18 years when we started with this, and from the very beginning, as you understand, working with Europe, working with the rest of the world is nothing that we added after. It's there from the beginning, and the networking with the globe. During this period, we have also developed an intercultural strategy that we're working with. We have set up a UNESCO office and working with these kind of challenges and possibilities, because there is a possibility. Migrants is not a big group, they are individuals with skills, language skills, they are educated, most of them actually, and they have cultural skills. So that is a possibility, not a problem. And the way we worked has yielded very good results, actually. So if you compare, because every municipality, I guess you do this in Poland as well and other countries, you have this kind of survey when you ask your citizens what they think about the work you do. If you compare the numbers and the figures, 1997 with today, it's a complete difference, especially among the young people. They are proud to live in this municipality. They have a better self-confidence. There are really good role models for kids and other young people. And they are involved in the further development in the municipality. And how is this, the Swedes? Because these people are Swedish citizens. They are not, I mean, if they have citizenship in Sweden, even if they don't have blonde hair and blue eyes, in Sweden today, people have dark hair and brown eyes. That's also a Swedish person. But we have a problem that we talk about the second generation, the third generation, and so on. But they are Swedes. So is that Botkyrka has become a model for how to work and with culture as a tool, as a vehicle, to change the self-image among the inhabitants, but also to change other things in the municipality. So I guess that some of them are jealous because there is also a self-confidence today that we have these, I guess all cities have, a motto that says far from average, because there's a Swedish expression that is lagom, and the best word for that is average. It's not too much, not too little, very Swedish. It's in between, not too much, not too little. And we are not typical Swedish in our municipality. We are far from average. And behind that are three words, that is openness, fearless, and energetic. So.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was... Well, I think we've had a great lesson in solidarity, in practice, practical solidarity. And now I want to ask Jerzy Hausner this question. At the beginning, I referred to one of the fundamental texts for the whole culture and development program. Culture is a way out of crisis. When you were writing this text, I think somewhere in the background was the issue of the economic crisis, although in your text you said that the crisis was more profound, it ran deeper. I think Katherine Watson listed the crises that we have to contend with. Alongside the economic crisis, there's a cultural crisis in a deep sense of the word. There's the crisis of democracy, a political crisis. And I'd like to ask about culture as a way out of crisis in the European space, because it is a European crisis that we're dealing with. Can culture offer a way out of this crisis, and if so, how? In that text, I wrote that we're witnessing the overlapping of numerous crises, that it's not a crisis within the system, it's a crisis of the system. And today, with hindsight, we could say that for decades, we believed that that change is the only certain thing. We believed we lived in an age of change, but there came a time when we have to say that we live in a time when the times are changing. The times themselves are changing. So we need to rethink a number of things. We need to discover a lot of paths, because what is typical for Europe today is this sense that we're intuitively searching for something generally like progress, like going forward, but which way is forward? Nobody knows that. There's no sense flocking in some direction if we don't know which way we're going or where we're headed. So the situation is different from what decision makers in post-war Europe had to deal with. And on the other hand, the range, the toolkit is the same. So the bottom line is that we're looking for a shift between the market and the state, and there's no solution. That's what I wrote. We will not find such a solution. That what we need is in fact not to look within the state or within the market. We need to look in between, and we won't discover the in between without culture. It can't be discovered without culture. And I also I said we should seek what we need by opening up public space and through various types of activities that create a common ground that is common but not mandatory, not imposed. So to discover the commons oneself. And it involves combining two things: a new discourse, a discourse about the essence of things and not symptoms. So you need to look deeper. You need to consider why this accumulation of factors, and we need to enable experimentation, because no formulas, no recipes will work. I'll begin with discourse, and I use the word discourse on purpose, by which I mean a reflection that digs deep, and it's not a question of communication. It's not a dialogue that can be talked over, where we can hammer out a compromise. That, of course, is necessary. It's democratic and it's proper, but we need something deeper. We need a discourse that will allow us to say why all this came together. And my answer, which is by no means the only possible answer, is that due to a number of phenomena, we live in an age where civilization is dominated by technology and has been dominated by technology, that it's beginning to recede. It's beginning to recede into an axionormative dimension, in its axionormative dimension, which means that there are no bounds to commercialization today. There are no limits. That economic activity and market activity today is conducted in such a way that the time is no longer a factor. It's a cult of flexibility, a cult of mobility, and a situation where activity means using every available opportunity. seizing chances. This opportunistic game is so powerful that it forces everyone to act accordingly, even despite their will. So there's the spatial expansion of this, and there's a compression of time, a terrible compression of time. So even if we want to think, we don't have time for that. There's no time. All that matters is effectiveness. All that matters is the outcome. Even at the World Economic Forum, where run-of-the-mill, where orthodox market thinkers meet, even they realize what a risk, how risky this short-term thinking is. If we look at the situation on global financial markets, they themselves see it as a threat because there are forms of economic activity that subvert, that undermine the purpose, the sense of a market. They represent a terrible threat to the market itself. Now, getting back to culture, I can say, we need to solve this problem using two hands. One hand is real discourse that allows us to define why the connection between the market and values has been severed, and whether this is inevitable, or can we conceive of another market economy where this connection will be reestablished. I believe we don't need to destroy the market, but we can conceive of such an action. The problem is, however, that we need to change the gravity field of economics. I call it a relational economics. So now, I say, if you want to act differently, if you want to change, you must understand how a company generates value. But even if you understand that, that's not enough. You need to find a conducive environment, an environment where you can do that, because the predators will eat you up. And predators don't think about resources, they exploit them. And so the question is, where can such an environment be found? How can it be created? And the question is, how can we use modern technology to set up a different game? How can we use blockchain technology that would provide such an opportunity? So where could this take place? In the cities, among others. But what does that mean? That means that we'll have to deny or challenge the approach, the mode of thinking that had for centuries dominated, namely the search for a universal idea of a city. Even if we look back at modernist thinking of 100 years ago, we'll see that city planners sought a universal idea of cities. Today it's not urban planners that decide, but salesmen of ideas who travel the world and believe that all cities should be creative or smart, knowing full well that what works in Helsinki will work in Basel, and what works in Basel will work in Munich, and they do very well. Thank you. But the problem is that the cities which have adopted such a concept are cities that actually live off of mobility, and at the cost of their own growth potential. They destroy that potential for the sake of mobility and to be a node in the global economic game. The point is to change the approach, not to look for a universal concept of a city, because every city must come up with its own concept, its own idea, its own specific process of creating value based on its own potential, the potential of its residents. And what mechanisms can be generated to make this work, so that if we generate revenues based on our own resources, how can we maintain these flows? And this is thinking about cities and urban economy in a pro-developmental way. Then you get time and responsibility. Without the temporal dimension, you don't get responsibility, because what matters is the short-term result. And it's not enough for us to say this, because it's been said already. However, we need to find ways of putting it into practice, practical action that could help accomplish this, that would work in every city depending on its potential. So let's try and determine, let's try and see how problems are solved, not in order to copy solutions, but to learn the method. And just as today, we're listening about how environments are shaped, we learn the method. We don't copy-paste. We don't look for a silver bullet. We're looking for evidence, for effects, evidence-based methods. But we need to experiment. We need to have the right to experiment, the right to respect and acknowledge an economy with multiple actors and multiple cognitive perspectives. And this brings me back to culture, because this can't be done if we don't understand that culture is an indispensable element of all human activity if humans are to be responsible. But culture can be a mechanism for development, because it can allow us to determine which way is forward. Why, what for, and not how. And we're not asking what for, we're mainly asking how, using what instruments. So discourse and looking for solutions, but without discourse, without shifting a perspective, without changing our approach, intuitive exploration will get us nowhere. We'll get hung up in a loop of adverse phenomena, and then the steamroller will come and flatten everything, as the Polish saying goes. Thank you very much for that statement. I think it's not as bad. I mean, we began this conversation, Philipp made it explicit, that we are at a point where we need deeply to reflect on how to act through culture, how to regain what seems to have been lost, this commons, this social commons that binds us. But when listening to your interventions, I felt that the basics in thinking about what culture is and what type of society, what type of European society, what type of culture should be encouraged. I mean, the elements are very stable, it seems, and they relate to very elemental basic values such as solidarity, inclusiveness, social inclusiveness, and naturally, I mean, freedom and democracy. Now, I think that this is a very positive and optimistic starting point for our future efforts to create a culture and a Europe. And does the audience have any comments or questions? Naturally, but since you've spoken a number of times before, let's see if anybody else would like to participate. If not, then of course you're free to ask your question or make your comment. Let's begin with Amina Vishnich.
Thank you. I will try not to occupy too much time, as I was before. A comment and a question, I don't know, you'll see. I will try to simplify things. What I'm afraid the most, looking back home and looking into different variations of what is happening around Europe and probably in the global thing, is that we are all threatened, that the democratic liberal values, of course, are threatened by something else. In a different shape in Russia, in a different shape in US, different shape in Europe, Turkey, etc., etc. I don't have to add too many examples. When I'm looking back home, what so-called conservative or right is providing to people, it's a kind of regressive idea, from my point of view, regressive idea of security, hope, meaning of life, if you like. And what are we providing from, let's call it left side, is question, and then a question, and then criticality, and then a question. And of course, you know, being at a conference of, I'm always calling you kultura polityczna, but kritika polityczna, or culture political critic. Of course, we have to have this attitude. But it seems to me that the right answers goes into direction of Mr. Professor Hausner, right? Of being able to provide new discourses and to start to think about why and what for, not only how are we going to make it, what will be the effects, etc., etc. In cultural sector, in my deepest belief, we made quite a huge mistakes 15, 20 years ago, or even before in Western countries, starting to talking their language, as we called it. This was all different advocacy platforms I was part of in Europe. We have to talk their language, the numbers, you know, the contribution of creative and, how you call them, creative and cultural industries to the GDP and all that. And I think we lost our battle at right that moment when we decided not to use where our power is to asking questions and providing some answers why and what for, or to providing, if I may say, you know, in a simple word, some sense of meaning of life, you know, some hope, some love, and then, of course, solidarity, etc., politics and policy, and then we come back again to the issue, what is the idea, what is the vision we would like to share about the future, what is the quality of life we would like to enjoy, and how this can be fair not only between us in Europe, but globally. Because some friends I know from Africa will always say, like, I don't want to listen, you're crying about your welfare state because your welfare state is made on our account.
Zanim poproszę Państwa o odniesienie się do tego, co mówiła Emina, czy są jeszcze jakieś pytania? Anna?
Yeah, I actually have a question that regards to my own presentation, but I keep on wondering of this thing, which is why, in your opinion, when the European Union addressed this problem about democracy and the rule of law and you know, on this whatever developments in the far and the right and left, why they do ascribe it to the cultural sector? Why is there this research? Why the research about the democracy is there?
Dziękuję bardzo. To w takim razie jeszcze pytanie lub komentarz od Pana i poproszę o odniesienie się naszych gości.
W tym, co mówił profesor Hausner, zabrakło mi jednego dodatku, mianowicie, że te warunki, do jakich trzeba dostosować swój plan organizacji miasta, musi zabierać też mentalność tych mieszkańców. Oni muszą ten plan niejako, o ile to jest możliwe oczywiście w dużej zbiorowości, przyjąć za własny. I tu miałbym pytanie do profesora. Pan jest praktykiem, na przykład Pan opracowywał to, co nazywamy planem Hausnera. Czy Pan tam może też stosował właśnie takie podejście, jak w tym planowaniu dla miasta? I czy te doświadczenia jakieś mają wpływ na Pana teraz pogląd?
Bardzo dziękujemy za pytania. Bardzo proszę naszych gości o odniesienie się do nich. Kto z Państwa chciałby
go first?
zacząć. Czyżby profesor Hausner?
In another order, let's say that I will be the first and you...
Okay. Okay.
Let me answer for questions in English, for question in Polish, in Polish. I really share this opinion that itemizing of discourse has a crucial meaning. So the question is not to exchange of opinion, but to set agenda. One of the issue, if I discuss about the city development, urban development, is, for example, a category right to the city. And I think that it's very important to discuss about right to the city, not only as a legal concept, but as a social legal concept put into the framework of development. And this is a very practical item. This is a very practical matter. And to discuss the right to the city, we will discover a lot of new possibilities and will be not closed within our understanding of urban democracy, plus new forms of, for example, deliberative part of democracy. Right to the city is not only just to give somebody a privilege, but it's also give him a real power to use opportunities, to create new opportunities. So it has negative but also a positive context, and how to discuss it, how to include, to introduce. This is a crucial, in my opinion, about the future of cities. Not only one category, but this is the notion. I think it's really very crucial. And of course, if somebody would like to discuss it from the left perspective, it doesn't change. This is the practical issue. And we may find different perspectives. And I think that we will find solution how to not only describe, but also to introduce right to the city. The second question was regarding the relation of culture and understanding the meaning of culture at the European level. A couple of years ago, when my, let's say, path to the new discourse and new concepts had started, I was invited for the European conference about the culture and development. People discussed not culture and development, they discussed relation between culture and growth. They discussed about creative industries. And I said, this is not meaningful. This is really not a good way to discuss the issue, because the problem is now how to economize culture, because it happened. It is already done. But the question is how to make cultural different part of activities. So we need completely different perspective. The leader of this conference was a Pole, a person whom I really like and respect. And I said, but this is a wrong perspective. And he told me, you are right. But leaders at the European level will not accept your perspective because they would like to hear about jobs and growth, nothing else. They discussed a couple of years ago about jobs and growth. And the culture was then the way to create more jobs and growth. So the problem which we have now, which we envisage now, is the false perspective of this discourse. And the third question was in Polish, so I will answer in Polish.
Sir, the Hausner plan was a bailout plan, a rescue plan. When I was Minister of Economy and Deputy Prime Minister, I was saving the economy from a financial calamity. One can argue whether my proposals were the best, but you can't argue we were in trouble. We were in deep trouble. And that was my public job. That was my public task. I took up the job, and I did half of it. I did enough to save us from catastrophe, but not enough to improve our situation. Two conclusions. A, I don't believe in the power of the government, the state, to succeed in such projects. And I don't agree that it's all about political will and power. Those who believe that the political power changes this complicated world are wrong. I was the fourth most powerful person in this country, and I know how painfully so, how little I could do. So I did half of my job. But there's the other conclusion that I have. The whole history of development, including the development of Poland, should teach us one thing. And that is, let's do this while looking for new paths of development so as to avoid any rescue plans, because they are costly. Let's not do something that is purely reckless as a state, as a government, because in most cases, all the troubles we fall into are the result of the lack of imagination of people in power. I have a low level of belief that this strategic thinking will be available at the level of the government or state. State have no brains. They have, leaders have brains, but not the state. So when this strategic view is lacking at the top, where is it? It's at the bottom. It's a grassroots level. So I believe in grassroots activity, I believe in the power of social movements, and I believe in islands and pockets of activity. So I'm not, and I don't believe leaders. Okay, before I give the floor to Karin Lekberg, I suppose I need to say goodbye to Professor Hausner. Jerzy, you've informed me that you would have to take your train after 4 p.m. So it's 4:05.
Okay. Karin Lekberg.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of things to take this off. I want to focus on your what you said there, because if you focus on capitalizing on culture, I think we are talking about something else. It's not culture any longer. It's business, it's trade. And I think one of the most important things for me as a former musician, is my background, I think that when I started to play the flute, the most important thing for me was the possibility to failure, to do the wrong thing, and to start all over again. It was focus, as Professor said, on why and what. Of course, you need to know how, but the playful part of this that engaged me and was the playfulness, to experiment. And culture has these kind of inside. It's inevitable for us as human beings to avoid culture because we are culture. It's nothing outside. We are culture. And it has always been important for me. The hardcore of culture is that you can try and you can fail. And you can try again and you can do the same mistake again. As a painter, you even tried hundreds of times. And in this new perspective, when it only becomes jobs and growth, there is no chance to fail. Because you have to make something, and then it's a trade. It's about trade. So when we talk about it from that perspective as only creative industry, it is not culture any longer for me. It's something else. Good or bad, it's up to others, or I have my opinion, but we have to find another word for it, because for me it's not culture any longer.
Katherine Watson?
I think, I mean, picking up on what you'd said, you particularly hit it on the nail of what the challenge is, of course. There's many people who have not only felt, but have actually been marginalized, left behind, see greater inequality, see their lives worse than their parents, don't see a future. And that has not been heard by enough people in positions to be able to make change or respond or first listen to it even before coming up with a solution. And even worse than that, discounted it in many cases to say, if it's about fear of the other, or my job's going to be lost, or my children's jobs, your fear is unwarranted, you know, and even worse, to say that you're maybe not smart enough to understand things, but a real marginalization of a group of people that then say, well, where do I look? So the choice could be to become politically active, which may not be that many would do that, and the other is to look, is there somewhere that provides me some answer? So people see an answer in the more conservative, right-wing, reactionary, nationalist perspective, because there is no other answer that's there, and it's almost, well, let's give this one a go. And that's what's incredibly troubling, because where we might one be troubled by it and not agree with it, it is a vision. So one always thinks, well, a vision is positive, a vision is beautiful, a vision is where we're going in the future. No, it's a vision that's provided. It's not a vision of the kind of world, the kind of communities that I might want to live in, or you might want to live in, or see our children and next generations live in. But it is a vision. And we have been completely incapable of providing a counter vision, and not even a counter vision, any other vision, because it is fraught with questions, and sometimes hugely well-meaning, of course, to think how we think things through, and they're more complex than that, and so on, because the other side provides they provide a simple narrative. They don't really provide an answer, because they provide something that says, I've heard you, and it will be solved. But if you look into it, it's never an answer that's there. So this is where we need to enter in, and I do think this is where, one, listening and understanding that the fears and concerns need to be, one, acknowledged and recognized and helped through by other solutions and other visions. And that's I think why we do what we do, and believe that culture is a vehicle there. I only pick up on one part of your question, which was city dwellers must own the plan, which I thought was a great translation of what you had said, because 100% for something in any community to move forward, if those in the community aren't part of it, it won't have the success, the sustainability, the rootedness that it should to actually be realized in the future.
Philipp.
Both your questions and the answers here made me think about the dilemmas we have in our work also. I had to think about when we published Another Europe. I did an interview with Ivan Krastev, the Bulgarian politologist who wrote this another kind of like account on the different protest movements all over Europe called Democracy Disrupted. And I asked him, which is also like a very personal question. I have like, Ivan, what did we do? You know, this past 15 years we believed with our work and collaboration with cultural initiatives all over Eastern Europe that, you know, okay, yes, it was challenging, but, you know, we are... Eventually we get there and societies become open, democratic, inclusive, and all the kind of like values we associate with our, but what did we do wrong? And then he said like, well, you know, in India, yeah, you know, I mean, you know, it was, did we overlook something, I asked. And he said, no, it was always there, and I don't blame you for it, but you know, and then he gave the example of Turkish soap operas being so unbelievably popular all over Eastern Europe now. And his theory is, why are they so popular? Because they depict the world as it once was, and traditional values and conservative values, home. And now I just had to think, what is this? This Turkish soap operas, they're enormously popular. This is creative industries, right? So if we say this is not even culture for us, maybe this is exactly an area where we have to start reflecting on what we are doing here. And the second ambivalence I currently also have to think about a lot is those who know the European Cultural Foundation know that we try to translate what we do on grassroots level, and in the social movements and networks we try to create on political decision-making level, especially on European Union, Brussels institutional level. At the moment we are, after 10 years, at the point where an idea, which we did not come up alone, but with many others, National Cultural Institute, different other foundations, more than 10 years ago we realized there is no culture when the European Union talks about its international relations. Also relates to the Another Europe idea, a question you asked me at the beginning. So after 10 years of long and exhausting advocacy work, there is now something called Cultural Diplomacy Platform, which was established by the Commission. But what is its focus? It has selected or identified 10 strategic countries around the world: Brazil, Mexico, Russia, India. The determination of these countries is was simply shaped by looking at who of the big growing nations around the world we have bilateral economic agreements with. So let's start the cultural diplomacy platform with them first. So you could say, okay, this is, you know, not according to what we have in mind. My experience is now, because we are part of a consortium together with Goethe Institute, British Council, different other national institutes, that delivers programming through this cultural diplomacy platform. European Cultural Foundation does one training, it's called Global Cultural Leadership Training, which was a terminology the Commission coined. We would not talk about global cultural leadership. But, you know, sometimes you have to then compromise, and now we can, I mean, the first edition already showed that a lot of ideas we developed in IdeaCap, in Tandem, in our programming, our thoughts, even our concepts, we could kind of like bring in through this platform. And my experience with interacting with EU institutions at the moment in Brussels is really a lot of soul searching and a lot of searching of new answers, and hence a lot of openness to think about these things differently too. And that at the same time is, again, I think, a word of caution for all of us at the end, and relates to Arno's question, why, when it's on research and culture, we come to the societal problems. This is maybe exactly what you also meant, Emina, that because we faced at some point shrinking availability of public funding for the cultural work and the arts work we maybe traditionally would consider as real cultural work in the pure sense, in the sense of we want to see it, started to disappear, and we had to find discourses of legitimation why we as cultural workers also matter for economics, and now we have arrived at why we matter for solving societal problems. And I think there's a big advantage in it and a big opportunity in it, but we also have to be very careful to say, like, we are not going to solve society's whole problems and Europe's whole problems. It's only in relation and in cooperation with other sectors and with a different way of working. I think that's what Jerzy Hausner's main approach was to culture as a and the whole day actually was talking about culture as an ecosystem in interaction with other spheres of work. And that's a big danger I see also, that we suddenly appear like, well, now we turn to you cultural people and you also don't have the answers. So what do we do now? That's a bit the danger and the risk I see for the next years.
Thank you very much indeed. I would like to take this moment to thank all the panelists this afternoon